All right, welcome back everybody to On the Ball, the video interview series from Vanderbilt Sports and Society Initiative. Really excited today to have two old friends, which is a phrase that John Seigenthaler would use. I know that came up quite a bit in the transcripts of the interviews that you have in your book. But Pat Toomay, former Vanderbilt and NFL football player, an award-winning author out in New Mexico. Pat, thank you for joining us. And Frye Gaillard, another Vanderbilt alum, author of over 20 books, I think it is, a writer in residence at the University of South Alabama, both of whom are the authors of A Word on Words, the best of John Seigenthaler's interviews, a book that just came out from Vanderbilt University Press. So congratulations on the book, and thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew.
Pleasure to be here, Andrew.
Yeah, and Pat, shame we didn't get to see you last week when Vanderbilt University had a really nice kickoff event for the book hosted by Chancellor Dearmeyer at the First Amendment Center. Frye was here. Pat, I know you're dealing with an injury and weren't able to make it, but I can say that the book was very well received at that event. And I think that if the response that we got there, Frye, was any indication, this book is going to be really popular with both the people that knew Mr. Seigenthaler and also those who just kind of respect what he stood for. And also, I would say just anyone who's really interested in books and reading and authors and good interviewing. This book has a lot to offer to everybody. Frye, what were your impressions of your trip to Nashville?
Oh, I thought it was great. It was a good turnout at the John Seigenthaler Center. It was great to meet the chancellor. I had never met him before, and he's very impressive. And I think he understands John Seigenthaler's legacy and certainly cares about all the First Amendment issues that Seigenthaler cared about. And it was good to see old friends. You and I got to be interviewed by John Michael Seigenthaler. John the elder's, TV star son, and that was cool. I told John Seigenthaler after he finished interviewing us, Andrew, that I had the feeling he had done that before. Like he had interviewed people before.
Very perceptive of you, Frye.
Well, I pride myself on that.
Well, we're going to talk about the sports interviews that are included in this book. I don't want to give the impression to people that this is primarily a sports book, but it is one of the sort of genres of books that you chose to include in your book. But for those who aren't familiar or maybe need a little refresher, can one of you tell us what was A Word on Words? What are we celebrating as part of John Seigenthaler's multifaceted career as a journalist and working in the presidential administration? But what was A Word on Words?
Well, he had a Nashville Public television program for 40 years in which he interviewed authors about their books. He wasn't paid for it, and he did 900 plus interviews during that period, which is astonishing. And he called it A Word on Words because that's what it did. But he interviewed like nobody else. He was prepared. The interviews weren't about him. I mean, he has this tremendous personal history. But he read every page of every book, and it was astonishing because in the book world, you never get that anywhere. He had a depth of knowledge of what you as an individual were writing about that was blow away, and it made you think this guy is something. Who is this guy? Who is this guy? And I had run into him early. When I got out of school, I graduated. I played football at Vanderbilt and graduated in should have graduated in 70, unfortunately. But I went off to Texas. I was drafted in the middle rounds by the Cowboys. And I got down there, and SEC football is one thing. Texas football is another. Thing. And I'd never experienced anything like it. And the evangelical world of Coach Tom Landry was thrust upon us. And I just started taking notes. And after a while, I sent, after I had about 50 pages, and I sent them to John Bibb, who was the sports editor at the Tennessean, and a darn good one. I'd gotten to be friends with him. And he passed them to Seigenthaler without me knowing. And then Seigenthaler sent him to a New York publishing house, W.W. Norton, where the editor-in-chief was a friend of his. Then I get a note from them saying, "Is there any more?" And I said, "No, but there could be." And so, I mean, so this was out of the blue. So I continued taking notes, and it was, it was inside stuff because that's how I was seeing it. And then Norton published the book, and Seigenthaler had done the whole thing. He'd done it just out of the goodness of his heart, I suppose, and he liked the point of view. He was interested in the point of view. And then later, when I wrote the novel, he had me on. He plugged the book and then had me on the show. And so that was my history there. And I thought, so for me, from the day I got out of school, from within months, I was blown away by this guy because nobody gave my stuff a reading like he did. And then he moved the way he did. I never would have considered writing as something to do had he not done that. And so now I was 23, and so it was a.
Well, and Frye, I think that gets to a point we discussed last week, is his interest in helping younger writers, or maybe not young chronologically. When he helped me with Strong Inside, I wasn't in my 20s anymore, but I was a first-time author, so here's a person that was so accomplished and had old friends that were so prestigious, and yet he never really lost an interest in lifting younger people up. And I know your relationship with Mr. Seigenthaler went back to your Vanderbilt student days.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. He was, he loved working with students, and I met him when we were bringing. I was chair of the Impact program at Vanderbilt, which was a student-run symposium in 1968, and we brought Robert Kennedy to campus, and Mr. Seigenthaler was integral to that because he and Robert Kennedy were very close friends. So close that John Seigenthaler was a pallbearer at Robert Kennedy's funeral. Well, when Kennedy came to Vanderbilt, it was a March night, terrible weather, freezing rain, sleet. But there were 11,000 people on campus to see him, and there were more than that, I think, at the Nashville airport. And I went out. Seigenthaler arranged for me to be part of the greeting party. And so I went to the airport. And then I didn't know that he had done this, but he also, Seigenthaler, gave me his seat in the car with Robert Kennedy for the ride to Vanderbilt. Which was just kind of the generosity that was his trademark, and it wasn't like he was, I mean, it was funny. He wasn't all warm and fuzzy about it. He just said, get in the car. It's you ride, and, so I did. I mean, it was an amazing opportunity. And then when I started writing, he was supportive in the same way that he was of Pat. And so Pat and I were at Vanderbilt at the same time, but I'm not sure we ever met each other at Vanderbilt. We knew of each other because I was a football fan, and Pat was aware of the Impact program and all of that. But we started exchanging emails, and we're talking about Seigenthaler, and then we decided, hey, let's kind of record and celebrate this corner of his legacy, And so sports is one of what, Pat, 5 sections in the book, I guess.
Yeah.
The presidents, the civil rights, the presidency, literature, meaning fiction and poetry, and then music, and then sports.
Right.
But there were enough sports interviews that, because Seigenthaler loved sports and he loved sports writing, and considered it to be a very important genre of writing. And so it wasn't hard to put together a really good section of the book about sports, which includes, by the way, his interview with Pat.
That's right. And so, in a way, is it fair to say this book is you guys paying him back a little bit for the role that he played in both of your lives to preserve in this form some of his best interviews and, really illustrate what he gave the world in terms of the insights into these writers and their books?
Totally.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yep.
Totally.
Okay. So as you mentioned,
the sole purpose, this is a university press. It's, there's not big money being thrown around by it. It was all out of the heart. And it was tedious work, some of it, going through the 900 interviews, culling 100, and then culling, it took years actually in process to get down to the final 25 or so that are there. And it was just compelled internally. There wasn't, I knew who Frye was. I didn't know that of his experiences, but I knew he was a big gun on campus. He's older, a year, I think. And I knew that he was involved in Impact. And the people those years were tumultuous years. We had tanks on West End. We had Otis Redding comes to play and leaves and goes down. Robert Kennedy comes and is assassinated. It was an intense period in Nashville during then. And then Frye was he was at the head of making all this happen. As a football player, I knew who he was because how does a student do this stuff? Because we never had time to participate in campus stuff other than to attend. But I had my eyes on. Something's going on here, is what I felt.
Well, that's pretty remarkable that here it is 50 years later, you all finally get a chance to collaborate on something.
Well, and we've visited, we've visited, I've shown in the sites here and all that. And, it was just hand to glove, basically, because of that past experience together in Central Tennessee,
Absolutely. And then, I have a connection to both of you that goes back to working on Strong Inside and Frye writing about Impact, not only in 68, but 67 with MLK
Right.
and Stokely Carmichael coming to town. But I felt writing about Impact in that environment that Pat's talking about, that Perry existed in here on campus, was the most interesting part of the book. And Pat, your relationship with Perry, and he talked about you being one of the rare white students on campus that made a real effort to get to know him. And he so appreciated the fact that you were on that freshman basketball team with him until you were injured and focused solely on football. But, I value our friendship, with both of you. And when you asked me to write the epilogue for this book, that was a real honor. Okay, but let's get to the
you did a great job, and we appreciate it.
Well, thank you. All right, so there's 4 books in this book, in your book, where there are interviews with Mr. Seigenthaler, and that's the way the format of the book is for those who haven't read it. It's the transcripts of his interviews with these authors. And the first of the 4 sports books that you focus on is The Sports Writer, which is a biography of Grantland Rice, which is another connection. One of the many students that have come to Vanderbilt on the Grantland Rice Fred Russell sports writing scholarship. But can you talk about Grantland Rice's influence on American sports? At the height of his career, he was essentially ESPN of the day, right?
Yeah, it's hard to gauge it. It was so interesting for me, not being from Nashville or the South, to enter this world of the Kentucky Derby and Granny doing everything that he did. And it just evoked, it was very evocative for me, the whole thing. I can't speak to the specifics of it.
Right.
It's been 3 or 4 years since we went through this, but his spirit was present in town while we were there. And it was John Bibb, who's the sports editor. they all, and the Derby at Vanderbilt, all the students, it was spring break, and everybody would go to all the events he talks about here. And you could feel his presence and his take all through this piece in contemporary Vanderbilt culture, is how I experienced that. And you went on a Grantland Rice, and Skip Bayless, he was on a Grantland Rice as well. He was a sports reporter for the Dallas Morning News for a long time, just coming out of school, so I knew him well in that regard. As mudslinger that he is. But he was grateful for for that scholarship as well. And I think whenever he's still at it, even today as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, Grantland Rice was someone that was not only reporting the news and writing these, famous poems or doggerel, whatever you want to call it, about the Four Horsemen at Notre Dame, or it's not whether you win or lose, but how you play the game. But he was also very close friends with people like Bobby Jones and Babe Ruth and Jack Dempsey, right? I mean, he was kind of a character that we don't really see today. Was such an influential person on the average reader, but considered on a par in terms of his celebrity with some of the greatest names of the early part of the 20th century.
Yeah, I think his sports writing was so extraordinary that it became part of the whole sports scene, and some of these figures that you talked about regarded him that way. And one of the things that the interview deals with is, what some of us today might think of purple prose in the, very extravagant, flowery kind of language that he used, but it was a different time. It was in some ways it began as pre-television writing, and so you had to if you had to be more descriptive and more engaging with the very wordsmithing that you did. And I think it also I think the just eloquence and of his language sort of spoke to the fact that he regarded sports athletics as a very important corner of the human enterprise, of human life. And I think that too. I had a sports writer friend in Charlotte who used to say that writing about sports is like writing about life in capital letters. I mean, there are so many of the themes of life that are there. People coming together for a common cause. I mean, there's probably no place in our society that you learn that more than you do in team sports. And then the courage and the heroism that he detected in people like Jack Dempsey and others, though he was critical of Jack Dempsey for not fighting in World War I, as I recall. So, there are interesting little currents even within that story. But I learned more about Grantland Rice. I knew him for scholarships to people like you, but I learned more about him than I'd ever known because of this interview in the book.
Right. Same with me. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it was a great interview. All right, the second book you have, and we're going through kind of fast pace here, but I want to cover all of them, is William Marshall's book, Baseball's Pivotal Era, 1945 to 1951. So this is the post-war era of Major League Baseball. I was really interested to learn about just sort of the precarious nature of Major League Baseball at that point, and including competition from the Mexican League, losing players and the threat of losing players like Stan Musial to the Mexican League at that point in history. What was it that really caught your attention in selecting this book for your book?
Well, for me, it was coming of age during that period and seeing Ted Williams, hit points and hit the ball out of the park, and just the figures, they all evoked my youth. I played baseball all the way through to college, and these guys, they were just part of as part of anybody who was a baseball part of your existence. It turned out that Mickey Mantle ended up living in Dallas and being a figure in town there during that period. So Ted Williams, I saw him in high school at DC Stadium and playing the Senators, and it just all came alive for me. And it seemed, Bob Filler, Rizzuto, it had to be included. It had to be included. And again, the interview was incredible. I mean, the depth of knowledge he had of this stuff, it was mind-blowing all the way through. And this was another instance of it for me.
Yeah,
and of course, Frye Jackie Robinson is a big part of this interview as well. Marshall talks about Jackie Robinson desegregating Major League Baseball as one of the most important moments in American history when it comes to race. And an example, sometimes sports lags behind culture, sometimes sports tends to lead in some ways. And, he says that this really kind of prepared the country for Brown v. Board a few years later.
I think so. I think it was a case of sports leading the country. And Jackie Robinson, handled that opportunity with both grace and courage, but also, with a kind of consummate dignity too, and was, an advocate for civil rights. One thing that we forget about that era is that he was joined very soon after, a couple of months later, by Larry Doby, who was the first
Right.
African American to play in the American League. I've always, in some ways, felt that history sold Larry Doby short a little bit. I mean, if you're the second guy, you don't get noticed as much. But part of that too was the magnetism of Jackie Robinson. I mean, the way he played the game, the speed, the intensity, but also his civil rights advocacy. All of that was present during those times. And one of the things that it reminded me of, when we think of baseball today, we think of a very popular sport. But back then, it was the American pastime. I mean, it was like much bigger than the NFL in those days. Not true today, but it was much bigger in those days. And so, our lives to some extent revolved around, listening to baseball on the radio. I can remember doing that with my parents when I was a very young kid. So anyway, all of that is captured in it. But Seigenthaler knew it. He just knew it, and Pat and I learned it, maybe, or were reminded anyway.
Well, the next one, I love this next interview. William Price Fox, Satchel Paige's America. And I mean, Satchel Paige, what an interesting figure. Obviously, like you couldn't do a boring interview on Satchel Paige, but there was a line in the interview from the author, William Fox, and he says a story or a novel or anything that's good has to have its own sound. And most people don't have any sound. They're just taught to be clear.
Right.
Clarity's okay, but it's kind of dull. And I just loved that. What great advice for a writer. Sometimes I know that I fall in the trap of just trying to be clear. And how did that line hit you? And how has developing a sound been a part of your own progress as authors?
Well, I love this. And William Price Fox was an amazing character himself here. And I didn't know much about Satchel Paige, and that he's out there at 49, and his sound, the way he described things as Price emphasizes repeatedly through there was just wonderful. And so for me, this was all Satchel Paige's America was all new and all fascinating and gripping in its presentation by Fox, who he's written a whole, it sent me off to see what else he'd written. He's such a character himself.
Right.
And, I felt we had to have it.
I'm fascinated by Satchel Paige, partly because he's from my hometown, Mobile, Alabama, which is very, we're quick to point out in Mobile that 5 Hall of Famers came out of Mobile. Henry Aaron, Billy Williams, Satchel Paige, Willie McCovey, and Ozzie Smith are all from this one, smallish city down on the Gulf Coast. Is clearly something in the water. But Paige may have been the best athlete of all of those, because I think he was 42 when he finally got a chance to play in the major leagues.
Right.
And he was 59 the last time he pitched in the major leagues, 59 years old. The Kansas City, whatever they were,
Monarchs.
Yeah, well, that was the Negro League team, but the Kansas City Royals or Athletics. I can't remember which they were. The Athletics at that point brought him back kind of as a publicity stunt, but he pitched 3 scoreless innings at the age of 59. And then the Atlanta Braves, when Paige was in his 60s, realized that he lacked a few months of active roster time to be on the major league pension. And so the Braves, when Paige was in his 60s, activated him, and he was actually on their 40-man roster. They did not let him pitch in a major league game, but he did pitch in a AAA exhibition game in his 60s. And he pitched a scoreless inning. Now, AAA, I mean, like, those guys are up and down from the majors, right? I mean, they're either on their way up and right knocking on the door, or they just been, I mean, those are good baseball players. So just the astonishing, ability of somebody like Satchel Paige. And then what comes through in his relationship with William Price Fox is that Paige absolutely knew it. Man, he knew how good he was, and he knew how good all those Negro League players were. I think he was the one that said of, I think, Buck Leonard, that he was so fast that he could turn off the light and be in bed before it's dark. I mean, those are, so, I mean, just fabulous stuff.
All right. And then the final sports book, Pat, I think you know this book pretty well. On Any Given Sunday, you wrote it. And there's so much we could talk about. I think I want to have you back to do just an interview just about this book and your thoughts on the NFL. But the thing that really captured me, I thought, was a really interesting part of your interview with Mr. Seigenthaler. And earlier in the interview, you talk about how NFL players are, kind of commodified as a product, or they're built up as a hero. But then you talk about just the joy in playing, and you said the playing is the thing, it's the beauty of it all. Right. Not necessarily the winning or the losing, but just the playing. You said you're part of the larger world when you're playing. You're part of, the sky and the sun and the moon, the earth, the water. Like, can you talk about that aspect of your career as an athlete, going back to when you were a kid, through college, the pros, just the joy of playing, and what you meant by you're part of the larger world at that point?
Well, that's harkening back to when you're about 11 or 12, and you got your brother and a couple guys out on the sandlot, and it's snowing, maybe muddy, and you're playing, you're throwing the ball around, you're running, you're tackling each other in the mud and throwing, and it just there's something transcendent about that experience. And you feel, it's cold, the winter, it's winter, it's not spring baseball, right? You're in the fall in the sludge, and it's exhilarating. That's all. And I always had that as a reference point as a kid growing up for all sports, really. And then it starts to get cut up, and you have to look for it. And that's basically the sort of point of view that I'm trying to bring to that conversation and to the game. And then you have gamblers and spreads and it's not about that. It's about, and there are I would meet people, on different teams, there would be people who knew exactly what that was and would play with that spirit, Otis Sistrunk was one guy, curator.
Yeah.
Attended the University of Mars, as he put it. He was a free agent guy. But when I went to that team, he was a defensive lineman, and he gave me his Cadillac to drive around until my own car could get there. And he just had that joy. He had kept it all that time. So that's a crucial part of it. All sports, and it from playing. I think everybody who played young and fell into that flow would understand that, I think.
Totally. When I was reading that interview, it occurred to me that you don't have to be as talented
No.
to play in the NFL. You don't have to be as talented as Pat. I mean, that joy that you were describing was absolutely present on the intramural fields at Vanderbilt,
Absolutely.
and probably in a more undiluted way, because we didn't have any pretensions. We weren't going anywhere. We were just out there in those same conditions that you talked about, and it was just the joy of competing. Even if we knew deep in our heart that we were failed jocks, at least there we were, and it was just fun. Well, the fact that, you and Otis and others kept that alive in the very complex, difficult, sometimes cynical world of the NFL, much less college. I mean, college football too, but I think it probably got harder and harder to keep alive the higher you went. I don't know.
Yeah, you had to. For me, it was finding it in my kids, and as they came along and started, they both had bad football injuries in college, and they had to find their realize, but that they found it in soccer. That flow of movement, and now in their kids, my grandkids, it's the same thing. They're finding that, and that's really, if you think about it, soccer, that movement captures it as well, and it's exhilarating at the end of a game, win or lose. If you play hard, that's the main thing, and so for me, it sort of shifted to them. And serious injuries, I thought. They both wanted to follow their dad's footsteps, although they went to an Ivy League school instead of an SEC school, but they still suffered the career-ending injuries, and it was painful to go through with them. And I just encouraged them, on the outside of that, and they discovered it for themselves in soccer, and so fantastic.
Brian, I'm glad you mentioned intramurals. I think about my experience at Vanderbilt, and whether it was as a student or any aspect of it. And two of my favorite memories, one is from an intramural basketball game, and this is for more younger people before the student rec center. So we would play at Memorial Gym, and I'm not a very good basketball player, but I had a great game. And I remember a guy on the other team was like, "Don't let him shoot," and was pointed at me, and like that was the highest compliment that I ever could have gotten.
Yeah.
And then the other was from intramural softball, which I am a decent baseball player. And we had some really intense softball games, and there's still a spot when I walk down 25th Avenue now that I remember my friend Bryce Wells was playing left field, sprinted towards the left field line, laid out completely horizontal, caught the ball, slammed into the fence. Still the greatest catch I've ever seen at any level my entire life. When I walk past it, I always send him a text or a message on Facebook. "Hey, I walked past the spot where you made that catch." And this was over 30 years ago. So yeah, those moments can happen at any level. But
right.
We're up against it now. But I just wanted to thank you guys for writing this book. It's so much fun to read. I do want to let everybody know, it's not just sports, although these sports interviews are fantastic, but it also includes interviews with the likes of John Lewis and David Halberstam, Pat Conroy, Ann Patchett, Alice Randall, Nikki Giovanni, Marty Stewart, Kinky Friedman, Waylon Jennings, John Meacham, Doris Kearns Goodwin, my dad. So, and that's just a sampling. So it's a fantastic book for people who are interested in any type of writing, fiction, nonfiction, word on words. Pat Toomay, Frye Gaillard, everybody get out there and buy this book. I know you will enjoy it. Thanks, guys, for joining us.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Andrew.
Andrew.